Okay, so we are now recording. This is the Asteroids 101. And as discussed previously in, I think, Discord and on a couple different classes and group calls, we decided to go with the format. So all of September, we're going to focus on asteroids. This works out because in August, I did publicly, and it's on our Patreon publicly, all of this astrology storytelling for the inner planets. And then if you look at our solar system, it's inner planets, the asteroid belt, then the outer planets, and then more asteroids, right? So this fits in perfectly in September to kind of focus on asteroids. And then October, we'll start working on outer planets and then some of the more far reaching asteroids. That's how I have it in my mind. I want to get through the main um, asteroids that we uh, tend to work with most in our birth charts and things like that this call. But I want everyone to kind of explore their asteroids and come to the next call with a little bit more understanding of their inner asteroids before we move into some of the outer ones. So the next workshop, we're going to do more one-on-one, more Q&A, giving me your birth charts. I can look at different things for you and such. So when we do that, we will get more into like the nitty gritty, but we're also going to be starting to 101 some of the centaurs a little bit. So that is what is before us today. I'm going to pause and give everybody a quick clear. My throat is clearly wanting it as well. So I'm going to pause the recording, but anyone listening to the recording, you will get the clear. I'll set that intention as well. All right, asteroids. I have this very vivid memory of playing a video game with my brother where you're like shooting asteroids and flying in between them, and I cannot talk about asteroids without that imagery coming up. And even when I'm doing an asteroid like casting for a birth chart, it's always in my mind. So we are going to talk about asteroids. We're going to talk about the asteroid belt. I'm first going to give you a breakdown of what the asteroid belt is in case you don't remember. Not everybody loved this part of school quite as much as maybe I did. So when you think about the solar system, and the sun is at the center, and then we have, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, the inner planets, right? And we're the planets that are more terrestrial. They're closer to the sun. Because they are close to the sun's gravitational pull, as they were pulled in towards the sun and held there in orbit, it's consistent enough. They get a core, they get a mantle, they get a crust, they have the layers. Things that are further out don't have quite as much pull. Some of them, we have gas giants out there and such. The main asteroid belt, there's a lot of debate if you get into astronomy places where, are these asteroids? A lot of it's junk, right? A lot of it is formation, extra materials from formation, but a lot of these asteroids could be previous planets. Some of them, that like one I'll talk about later, is metal, and they think it might be the metal core of a previous planet that's just been blown to smithereens by so many impacts. Some of these are like failed planet startups, right? Like where a planet was forming and then something happened and it was pulled off of its orbit and was kind of pulled into this asteroid belt. And then there's other asteroids where like one of Saturn's moons is basically an asteroid comet that was pulled in by Saturn and is now its moon. And so there's this ever-changing aspect to asteroids. And it's expected that any asteroid, if it gets perturbed close enough to the sun, it will become a comet. Right. And so at any point in time that could happen, but it's less likely with some of the ones we're going to be talking about today. And then within these asteroid belt areas within the main belt, you see that there are these littler, smaller asteroid belts. And within these, you will see that there are some that we talk about. The Apollo's asteroid belt right there, that's where they goes from outside Mars right up closer to the sun than Earth, right? So if you follow that asteroid belt, it goes between the sun and Earth and then back out again. That's called Apollo, so you can remember it that way. Mars is the one that goes from outside of Mars and into the Earth's orbit or crosses the Earth's orbit. And so we call those near Earth asteroids. And this is just a lot of stuff maybe you don't necessarily need to know. Um, so the main belt is between Mars and Jupiter, and it is the geographical marker of what is an inner planet and what is an outer planet. So if it's within the main belt, it's an inner planet. Some of the asteroids are small, like little pebbles, right? And some are big, some are like dwarf planets like Ceres. There's over 7,000 asteroids that have names. So if you go to astro.com or astroseek and you plug in you could have so many options, and I don't recommend it. Unless you're really truly working on something and you start digging into, and this is usually after years of studying your birth chart, you may find an area of interest in your birth chart. You may find you have, I'll use me for an example, an 8th house stellium, and that there's fixed stars that point you to certain things. And then you want to dig deeper. You could certainly, and I certainly have, pull up all the asteroids that were around this area of your birth chart at the time of your birth, and then dig into that. It's like sometimes pointless what I want to offer up, and sometimes not. Sometimes it's confirming, sometimes it's helpful to make sense of something, but not necessarily required. And why I say this is that asteroids in general, especially the larger asteroids, they give nuance to something. I've learned it as it's the salt and pepper of the meal, right? Where no matter how the meal is cooked, you may want more salt, you may want more pepper, and this is the nuance that gives it to you. Trying to pick out every asteroid that was near, certain things when you were born is kind of like loving a meal so much that you start focusing on how much chili pepper was in this, and well, how much cardamom powder, and well, but what kind of turmeric, and where was the turmeric from? It's unnecessary to pick apart all the things. Though certainly if you have an area where things are becoming difficult, it can be easy, as if you ate a meal and it was delicious, but then you had a weird reaction. And so you wanted to go back through all the ingredients and see maybe if there's a pattern, right? And so being aware of something can then help you suss out a pattern. So that is my spiel on asteroids. They are nuance for us as we are exploring our birth charts and what significance they may hold, but you want to look at them through the lens of this is really the flavoring, right? This is the salt and pepper. This is the cardamom powder. This is not the meat and potatoes or the tofu and broccoli or whatever it is. So just having that kind of scope in your mind. What is interesting about our solar system is that Jupiter's formation caused the disruption of a lot of asteroids. The asteroids that may have gone on to become, sorry, I was listening for something, gone on to become planets were kind of thrown off their ability to become planets by Jupiter. And I find this interesting. I consider this in my astrology, right? What is the Jupiter relationship to this asteroid? And you want to dig into that. And I do that with the storytelling versions as well. We'll get into the versions more throughout the month than I'm going to do too much today, because I would like everyone to have just a very clear idea of what these asteroids are. The 4 largest asteroids in the belt: Ceres, Vesta, Pallas, and Hygeia. We have been introduced. I introduced Pallas when we talked about retrogrades. Pallas is in a retrograde right now. And so when I went through the fall of 2021 workshop, I introduced Pallas quite heavily, right? So we should have some familiarity there. And just remember going forward that this is nuance. And so we have to look at it from that aspect. So the inner ones I call the goddesses. This is a little bit blurry. I couldn't get a higher resolution one, but this is to put it into perspective. You hear about Pallas, you hear about Chiron, you hear about certain asteroids. And I think that we forget that Ceres is quite large comparatively, to other asteroids. And so the fact that we don't hear about it as much, it's closer than Chiron, it's larger than Chiron. So it's interesting when people evaluate Chiron's influence, but not Ceres. So I just wanted to put that into a little bit of perspective as we go into asteroids. Ceres is the largest object in the asteroid belt. It was reclassified as a dwarf planet in 2006, making it the only dwarf planet for now that isn't in the Kuiper belt. And the Kuiper belt, and I always say this differently than other people, but it's outside, right, of the outer planets. So when you're thinking about that, it's like even further, and that's where most dwarf planets are. But this one is in our main belt. It's 14 times smaller than Pluto. And Pluto's, has had a weird standing with planet status. Unlike other asteroids, Ceres has enough gravity to mold it into a sphere. So there's like 4 criteria to be a planet instead of an asteroid. One of them is that it has to have enough gravity to be a sphere. That's very important. And there's another one along the way that we'll talk about. Ceres has a composition that could sustain life and has been a very interesting part of research, trying to figure out if it had had life before or where it could be in its development. Ceres was named after the goddess of agriculture, the earth goddess. It shows up in your birth chart to show you how you best receive nurturing energy, typically referred to as mothering. It's a very, very close nuance aspect of mothering. How do you receive mothering? How do you give mothering? There's a lot of trauma can show up here where when people are trying to heal their mother wound, it is always helpful to know where the Ceres is so that you can dig into why maybe you have mother wounds. Oftentimes, and this is something we talk about with my children as well, I mother in a way that comes from my trauma of being an orphan. So I over mother sometimes, not helicopter, as in like I dig in a little bit more. I'm always present. I'm making sure they always know I'm present, right? And then also making sure that they have privacy. And I'm always worried about every aspect of molding a human being as possible because I didn't have one. I'm trying to, do it the right way. And so my kids will always say, "No, you're a great mother. It's just, I do have this wound from this, right? Or I wish you would do this." And that's because and when we dig into their Ceres placement is actually in this particular place and they receive nurturing with physical touch. So, and this is all just hypothetical, and so with physical touch, then I know, okay, I need to hug more. Okay, you need hugs more, you need hugs less. And each individual child will have their own way of receiving it. And so it's not always going to be your Ceres placement and your mom's Ceres placement isn't always going to tell you if you have mother wounds or not. It's going to tell you what that mother wound might look like. And then if you look at your mother's Ceres, you might think, oh, okay, she had this love language and this form of nurturing. This is where it adds nuance, right? How do you best receive it? And like, I am not a physical touch receiver of nurturing. I actually need words. Right. And so people are always trying to offer a hug when I'm sad, and I don't want a hug when I'm sad. And so there's different things like that that can show up for you, and digging into your Ceres and learning more about where Ceres is for you and in what house Ceres is for you. My Ceres placement is very interesting because money and career and stability and safety is very important for me to feel nurtured. And so it often points to that kind of a relationship and where you might be finding fulfillment. Vesta, this one I get very excited about. Vesta is the second largest asteroid in the main asteroid belt, still only half the size of Ceres. In 2011, it was discovered it may have been a planet and that it was on its way to becoming a planet, but Jupiter threw it off of its orbit and it was then unable to maintain on orbit to become a planet, but it has a core and it has a mantle and it has a crust and it's almost spherical. And when it was examined, right, in 2011, 2012, it almost became a dwarf planet, but but just barely missed that mark of being completely spherical. It's smaller than Ceres, but it's brighter, and it's the only main belt asteroid that you can see with the naked, unaided eye. Again, so it's important, right? This is something our ancestors would have seen, been able to see, and been able to observe. So Vesta is the goddess of the hearth, right? One of Jupiter's sisters, one of the Vestal virgins that tended the sacred fires of Rome. This is the element that shows how you tend the fires of your home, how you tend the sacred energy of your home, how you keep and tend the sacred energy of your family, of your marriages. These were sexual priestesses that were later forced into celibacy and became almost nun-like. But this is how this shows us our sacred sexuality, our sacred devotion, our sacred spiritual service, how we show up, how we bond, how we have intimacy, how we create a home, how we create an environment around our relationships. It can also show us where we obsess over things. And I find that Vesta is, I should go back while we're talking about it. Vesta is one of those placements that I look to almost first whenever somebody comes to me with a relationship issue or a career issue. So you want to find where Vesta is, what house it's in, and then you'll probably show that, oh, okay, that's where I bring the sacred fire in my life. But this can really point to people that have really difficult placed Vestas can have a really hard time creating a home, right? So when you're talking to people and they're like, oh, and this doesn't work, and this doesn't work, and I keep trying to get him to do this, or I keep trying to get her to do this, and there's constant, issues in the home, oftentimes you'll find that Vesta placements are like opposite ends, or they're the exact same, but they're in something like Aries, that doesn't necessarily create stability in the home. Where, if a Vesta in Taurus wants luxury in the home and wants soft, pillows and blankets and candles and scents, and then they're married to Vesta and Aries, that's just like, I'm going to knock down this wall. I'm going to do, and so that can bring clashes. So if you have that going on in your home, you want to look at different Vestas. If your kids won't help you do the things you want in the house, where is their Vesta? How do they create a sacred fire? Help them work within their wheelhouse, right? This is a good placement, a good thing to look at with Vesta placements. Pallas. We talk about Pallas quite a bit. My Pallas placement, it gave me so much freedom when I first learned it, because I have this energy about me that no one ever understood. And traditional, astrologers don't really deal with Pallas placements. And so when you're dealing with people that don't look at Pallas, and they're only looking at certain planets, then certain aspects just might not make sense. And one thing that almost every astrologer because I've had a lot, especially in my upbringing, say, your anger, your fire, your rage, it really must come from trauma. That's what people would tell me all the time. And I remember the first time I cast my chart to include extra asteroids and saw my Pallas's in Aries, I was like, oh, come on. See, this is what I needed to know. And that's why I find asteroids to be I'm textbook Pallas in Aries. It explains so much about how I get angry, right? And how I fight and how I go to war. And so it's this warrior goddess. But this is the second asteroid ever discovered. We've known about it for a long time. It's the third most massive asteroid, very unusual orbit. Look at it, how it's in next to Mars, right? And then it goes way out by Jupiter. So it has a very interesting orbit. Also, it's heavily cratered. It's been to war, like more than Ceres and more to Vesta. And I find that very interesting. Full of craters. It's almost has a violent history of being impacted by tons of asteroids, and yet it remains. And so when we look at Pallas, we look at our warrior goddess, our inner warrior goddess, not just our Mars. You have to consider your Pallas, right? So strategic wisdom, justice, healthy relationships. How do we give and receive love with our father figures? With the government, right? With with the patriarchy, anything like that. Look at me clear my throat chakra. Anything like that, you want to look to your Pallas, and it'll explain a lot. I was a rule breaker growing up in my teen years, especially. And my mom would have her friends look at my chart. Look at her chart. Why is she like this? And they'd say, oh gosh, I don't know. Maybe because her dad died, right? And it probably, but also my palace is right smack in the position, right? So, oh, and then when you're examining your palace and any asteroid, if it's heavily aspected to your inner planets, or if you have a lot of outer planets that are significant in your chart, and then it's heavily aspected to that, you'll see it more. My palace is heavily aspected within my chart, and so it's even more significant. Some people might have a very lightly aspected or have no aspects whatsoever. And so you won't see it show up all the way. So you want to evaluate the house and the aspects it makes to other placements in the natal chart. So Juno, um, and I'm laughing because in our house we say Juno, as in, so it's funny, and not funny. It's like one of our dad jokes. But it's the third asteroid to ever be discovered. It's the 11th asteroid, largest asteroid, sometimes known as the 10th largest, which seems insignificant, but there's like debate. It is small but highly reflective. So it's got like silica type coating on it. So it's super reflective and can be viewed with binoculars, even though it's small. When it was discovered, they thought it was a planet. It is not a planet. It's not spherical enough to be a planet. It is closer to the sun than Ceres and Pallas, and it gets closer to the sun than Vesta, but then further out than Ceres when it's furthest away, right? So it's got that wild orbit as well, comes in really close and then goes out really far. It was changed by a disruption by an asteroid getting close to it. So data that we have pre 1839 is slightly different because its orbit changed slightly due to this discombobulation by a passing asteroid. Now, Juno, I'm not going to make the dad joke every time. Juno is the goddess of marriage and commitment to kingdom, not just commitment to each other. Goddess of marriage and commitment to kingdom, like as in the duty to her people. You will find often that people with significant Juno placements will struggle with this commitment to the larger person, or to the larger community, especially if they happen to also be a Gemini or an Aquarius. It's like the good of humanity will weigh them down really, really intensely. Juno was queen of Mount Olympus, wife to Jupiter, but Jupiter was always running around on her. She was always out there punishing him and bringing him back home, coming out to get him. She is like, I joke that she's the patron saint of women who are exhausted by men, right? Because Jupiter is just the worst descriptor of male commitment, like the most devolved archetype of male commitment, and or yang commitment. It doesn't have to be male, but that, more aggressor type energy. This is and especially if this happens to be like a Juno in Taurus or Juno in Virgo or Libra, right? This would be a diplomat, right? Dignity, commitment, leadership. This placement's going to show you how you show up in those spaces, and how you really lead your people, even if you don't feel like you have people, right? This would be how you would lead people if you had them, or maybe how you lead your family, or how you interact in your marriage or your commitments. This a very strong placement to Juno with a lot of aspects can be very reliably a forecasting element to that like karmic level prominence in community. So people that are like Hillary Clinton has a large Juno placement, like large, not like a significant Juno placement. People that, like women in particular, or people who identify as women, that yin energy are elevated by a positive Juno placement up into authority quite quickly. Even though people would have, if Juno was of modern times, people would have so many problems with her dealings of Jupiter, but they were what they were. And this element in our birth chart shows up as this duty and commitment, regardless of if you want duty or commitment, right? This is just how it shows up. And just, I saw a question in the chat. Significant placement means it's either in a house that is of significance, so it's activated. A significant placement would be an aspect to your chart ruler or to some of your major players in your birth chart. If it was conjunct Venus, if it was opposite Mars, things like that could be significant. So if it's within 1 to 2 degrees of a significant aspect, so conjunct, opposite, square, trine, et cetera, would be significant. If it's out of bounds, right? Like if it's not actually aspecting anything, it might not give too heavy of a dealing. You could look at it with its significance as to what house it falls under and what sign it's in, and see if it gives a little bit of nuance there. But some people will find that they have asteroids that are heavy players, right? They're right up conjunct something very important, or they're, at a very significant degree or something like that. Hygeia, very rarely talked about in a lot of astrology places, and I'm always looking for it. I think oftentimes people don't quite know how to talk about Hygeia. Hygeia was the daughter of medicine, right? The god of medicine, which I'll get to in a second. I'll just stick to the astronomy first, right? Because my storytelling kicks in fast. So it is in talks currently. Since 2019, it was discovered to be much more spherical than previously thought. So this is very recent. Okay. Just in 2019, all of a sudden, different abilities to truly test something came into play, and it's spherical, right? So it could become a dwarf planet, which would be amazing, but it's super tiny. It's just over half of the size of Ceres, but it is the fourth largest in the asteroid belt. May become a dwarf planet, maybe not, but what's I find to be so fun and fascinating is that it's practically craterless, right? The craters it does have are very minimal. And I find that interesting because Hygeia is the ruler of health and healing. And what they think happened, this is just a theory, but one of the models that they think happened in the creation of Hygeia is that it actually took a lot of hits, but it was early on in its development. So it sort of like melted back down and then started to spin and create gravity and then like healed, right? So that's what's extra awesome about its name being Hygeia. Hygeia was the goddess of health, daughter of the god of medicine. Hygeia brought prevention to the table, right? Like cleanliness, almost like Florence Nightingale, if you will. So she brings the ideas of we need clean water, we need fresh food, we need to move, we need to, center our minds, we need well-being, we need balance, we need harmony, all the prevention stuff. And so what you can do with Hygeia to work with it in your birth chart, where is your Hygeia? It may point to areas where you need prevention, right? Like, maybe you were born, maybe if it was conjunct Chiron, that you were born under Chiron in a retrograde, you may need to bring some prevention to how you deal with your wounds from your childhood, right? Prevention and not just reaction all the time might help you summit that mountain of an issue in your birth chart or in your life, right? It gives like a quality to it where this may be where you can circumvent some of the things that keep coming up for you. So you look to Hygeia to see what might be missing, where can you add more prevention? And then you can dig into it too, depending on what area it's in. So if it's in Virgo, you need prevention around your gut, around how you handle stress, around, very physical things. So it just depends. And that's one of the things you want to look at: the sign, the house, and is it aspected to anything intense? And some health educators, healers, researchers have very significant Hygeia placements, like Louis Pasteur, the person who first found antibiotics. His Hygeia is conjunct his north node. So his major like development in antibiotic creation pushed forward the whole of humanity. So it being right up against the north node is significant. It's interesting, right? It's interesting, if anything. Some of the lesser asteroids, and I'm going to talk about these very, very quickly because I do want to introduce centaurs just a little bit. And I know that I'm running short on probably time with the kids. But the lesser asteroids, and these are some that you'll hear talked about. Some, I feel like some astrologers will pick them up and get really into them and get kind of obsessed with them and dig them out in everyone's chart, and then other people just totally dismiss them, and I like to do a little bit of both, especially when I'm doing compatibility. So I wanted to introduce these in case you decided to dig into some of your compatibility with your spouse or your exes, or somebody you're dating or whatever it might be. Getting into these can be a little interesting, and I just did a forecasting of Eros and Psyche for one of my friends as they're dating someone new, and their birth charts were looking so good. I'm like, okay, I need to dig into some asteroids because this could get really interesting really quickly. So Eros is considered a near Earth asteroid. It comes within the boundaries, it crosses the orbit of Earth. We will feel Eros in in certain areas, and so I find it significant to know where this was when you were born. Eros was Aphrodite's son, god of erotic love. This is really what turns you on physically. When I'm evaluating Black Moon Lilith and when I'm getting into Pluto, I really like to look at Eros and just see, just curious, just curious where it is, right? To help you kind of hone in on what turns you on, and maybe it's something that's been kept from you your whole life. And maybe just reading about it might be like, oh yeah, okay, this is going to help me. I call this the Jack Harkness placement. And if you're not a Doctor Who fan, that is probably going to be lost on you. And if you haven't watched Torchwood, it even still might be lost on you. But Jack Harkness loved everybody. Nobody was off the table, right? And that's the kind of element like Eros shows up with. So wherever Eros is in your chart, it might show where you have an attachment physically to the sexual triggers in that area in a good way. In a good way. We're talking good things here. Psyche. Psyche is the metal asteroid I mentioned, and there is actually a mission planned in 2022 that I'm excited about, and they're going to go to Psyche and test her because she's metal and she's not like most of the other asteroids, and they think that she actually is a possibly, right, one of the theories is that she's a stripped down planet, right? That she was a planet that got hit with so many asteroids and it just wore away at everything but the metal core that was there. So we're talking this could be very ancient. We're talking this could be a lot of just what's exposed here after battle. And I think that imagery is awesome. So Psyche was immortal, right? She was a princess and she offended Aphrodite, and Eros was sent to kill her. And when Eros came to kill her, they fell in love. And so this is often used in a birth chart to tell you what turns you on sexually from an emotional standpoint, not logical and not physical. What emotional connection do you need in order to unfold sexually, right? And this is a big thing in compatibility charting, I believe, right? That nuance of just the wrong. Okay, I think they're okay out there. Of what just the one wrong word that could turn you off and things like that. It might make some more sense to you. But I always think about it as even what is meant to harm you, you could just love or could turn you on. This is kind of where you get into like the darker parts where maybe you like a little bit of this in the bedroom, or maybe you like a little bit of that, or maybe 50 Shades of Grey wasn't too off base for you. This could be your Psyche placement showing up. And so this is a fun one to dig into. Don't get too serious with it, but yes, this is one of my favorites. And with I hope I have time to introduce the centaurs. We're not going to get into individual centaurs. I just want to bring up why I'm not talking about them yet, basically. Question in the chat: where do you find the placements of hygiene and the smaller ones? Astrofuture doesn't have them. You have to go to either astro.com or AstroSeek. AstroSeek, I believe, is the one that I find is better. And I'll put that in Patreon when I post the recording. And so The centaurs. Why am I not talking about the centaurs? I'm doing asteroid 101, and I knew that there would be questions. So I just want to talk about it a little bit. It doesn't fit into this conversation that we're having with the inner asteroids. The centaurs are a whole group of asteroids, and there's a lot of them. There's at least like 13, I think, that I want to talk about. So it's a big topic. They're beyond Jupiter. Okay. So we're talking that they're outside of this main area, but they're past Jupiter, but still within the bounds of Neptune. They're unstable. They cross the orbits of other large planets. So when you look at certain asteroids that are in the centaurs, when you look at certain centaurs, they're like wild, right? And they can go and they can cross in different ways. And so it gets a little bit more intense. They exhibit the nature of both comets and asteroids, right? So the centaurs, like halves, like half man, half horse, they're half and half. They're comets, are they asteroids, are they planets, right? They think that there might be rings around Chiron. They're not really sure. And so there's all of these different things that are still being unfolded with the centaurs because they're far. The asteroids in the main belt have been landed on, right? There are asteroids in our main belt that have had actual landings. These ones are so far out that there's things being discovered all the time. Like one of the things that Saturn's moon Phoebe may be a captured centaur, which I find adds into a lot of astrology things that I do. Really fun. And Ceres may be an ex-centaur, funnily enough, right? And so now it's in here in our main asteroid belt, but could have possibly been a centaur at one point. Any centaur that is shaken up, perturbed, too close to the sun is expected to become a comet. So it's something that we are always aware of, the spontaneity and chaos within a centaur. Centaurs deal with blind spots, with wounds, with fringe concepts. They are dealing with the subconscious or even totally unconscious shadow work, right? When we do shadow work, we deal with Chiron retrograde right now, shadow work, right? So when we evaluate the centaurs, we have to be really digging deep with the objective that we want to understand the chaos of life, maybe not always prevent it. Your childhood triggers are going to trigger. Your wounds are going to trigger. You can't bypass that. You can't spiritually bypass that. That's like the most unhealthy thing in the world. You want to look at the shadows, you want to look at this other side and integrate these aspects, but trying to I'm going to try to avoid every single pitfall. That's not the way to work with centaurs. You want to work with them as, this is why I react that way, and then dig deeper into it. Centaurs require a lot of study. I feel that even just digging into Chiron could be a 5-year long intensive. When we start to learn about centaurs as a group, I want to do it from a place where we just learn the very basics of all the centaurs and then pour into it a little bit more individually if anybody needs it and such. So centaurs really do start to get into where you're dealing with a lot of stuff that could maybe make you feel triggered and maybe a little painful, right? And so as we get further into asteroids as a group, that's something to look forward to. But that's why I didn't bring up Chiron today in this recording. Just the basics, just the most impactful from a location within the solar system. So that is the workshop today, you guys. And I can't do Q&A today because I have babysitters are on a clock and it is ticking. So I'm going to hop off unless there's any major questions. I'm going to stop the recording.